Okay, here we are going live. Live on Facebook. Hi, everybody. Welcome to near the end of this season of Coffee and Connect Chat with Sue. And yet again this evening, I have my wonderful friend, Rachel Gotto, who's also here in Galway with me. And this week, we're talking about coping with grief, that shared human experience that none of us can escape. And as we enter the Christmas period, it can be an exceptionally painful, difficult time for so many people. And Rachel and I would like to chat about that. And we'd like encourage you to ask your questions. Rachel is an author, a professional speaker, a mentor, and a therapist. And she has a wealth of experience in this area, and on a personal level too, which she will share with us this evening, how she has managed to cope at the end, that there is hope, and how she has managed and can guide us and maybe support us also, or if you have loved ones in that position in some way. So Rachel, thank you so much for taking the time to come and join us again this evening.
Oh, it's lovely to be here, Sue. And I think it's a subject that is really, really important and becomes more important at this time of the year. And my own personal grief of coming up to Christmas has been something extremely challenging, extremely disturbing, lonely, isolating, and scary, because likely for a lot of people, Christmas is the one time when somebody who's absent is most noted, and that can bring the most awful feelings of grief and loss and shame and guilt. You name the emotions and feelings, they generally come to the surface before Christmas, and it is particularly trying. So it's my pleasure to be here and to have come on the other side of grief myself, and as a therapist and as a coach and mentor, to be able to share at least, and let's have a discussion around it. I think it'd be gorgeous.
Yeah, because you've had your own, as I said, personal experience, yet you've also mentored other people going through this. So you've had many different perceptions and experiences and situations that grief has arisen from. And as we discussed earlier, grief can come in many forms, you know, from loss from, as I was saying to you, from a pet, or grief when you have to, when you're overcoming like a divorce or a separation, or it can be loss, like we're going to talk about this evening. And they are very real forms of grief. But this evening we're going to discuss more that loss of a loved one. And if you'd like to, and you're comfortable to share some of your experience with us, we'd be really grateful, Rachel.
Sure. And I think that one important thing is actually the empathy and understanding, you know, the wounded healer, and it's often mentioned. And I have always found that the people I turn to have generally had the experience that I'm experiencing, but have come through it. So absolutely. And I'm more than happy to share my own losses. And so at a very young age, I lost my closest brother to me in age. And we were incredibly close. He died very young at the age of 28, and I was sort of just 27. And the thing is that loss was catastrophic at such a young age. I had no experience in life. We'd shared a sort of an adverse childhood together, and we were probably only really just coming out of it. And we were split, we were apart, and he died very sadly. And that was tough. And that's a completely different grief to the other grief that I've experienced, which was not too many years later, when I was 29, that my husband died tragically in an accident when I was pregnant. So another form of grief that was catastrophic, that completely stopped my own life in its tracks, and life had to go on at the same time. And then a couple of years later, actually, just 1 year later, my father died. And that was another completely different loss, because I wasn't close to him. We didn't have much of a relationship. So that form of loss isn't, you know, too far away from my own life. And of course, I do work with people who experience loss and grief, and I support people who are going through the traumatic experience of sudden death. But to go back what you said just at the beginning, Sue, it just doesn't have to be personal loss. It doesn't have to be sudden death. It doesn't have to be what we term, sudden death or catastrophic. Everyone's loss is individual. And I read somewhere, and I thought it was a brilliant little sentence, which he said, everybody's loss is as individual as a fingerprint. And I think, isn't that amazing? Because a lot of people wonder, are they doing their grief right? Are they getting it right? And I often have people saying, what stage am I at? And of course, that goes back to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of loss and the denial and the bargaining and the acceptance and, all of those stages. Now, I knew about those stages when I was going through my own losses. And to be honest, I think they're brilliant from a training perspective and from an academic perspective. When you're going through deep, tragic loss of yourself, it is of no value to label really anything, because grief comes and goes, it waxes and wanes. It can be extremely challenging one minute, and you might be, doing okay the next. And so I always say to people, you're going to do grief your own way. That is it. You will do grief in your way. You are informed by your own experiences, what your life was like before the loss. Had you underlying issues that weren't tackled? So everybody is so different and will respond in their own way. But the thing is, I think, is the most important message to give anyone is that you will eventually come to some further shore. And I always say that grief is a bit like boarding a ship that you didn't ask for the ticket for, and it's bound for a destination that you don't even know yet. And that you have to stay on that ship and trust that it's going to bring you to the shore safely out the other side and in better waters. And for me, that was how it was for my own experience, Sue. I didn't know how I was going to come through. Particularly with the tragic loss of my husband. I didn't know how I was going to do this. It was just so unfathomable. I was bereft, I was broken, I was confused, I was frightened, I was overwhelmed. My heart felt it would break. And I'm sure people who watch this or are listening, they will identify that there are no words to describe what we experience when we lose.
Very physical and mental pain.
Very physical, and that's so important for people to understand that yes, it is a physical response as well as an emotional response. And a lot of people are fatigued and exhausted, and they don't really have any motivation or any energy to do anything.
And as you said as well, life still goes on. The world around you still ticks over.
It sure does.
And you have to continue.
Yes, absolutely.
Did you find, I'll just ask you questions as they come
Please
up for me.
do.
And as I said, we invite everybody or anybody who has any comments or questions, please do ask. This is all about connection and shared experience, and we're there for each other. What I was going to ask there is, did you find that each time that you had those very personal, very close to you losses, did you find that maybe you had tools and techniques to use for the next one, or was that of no value? That first of all, I'll have a load of questions popping into my head.
Looking back, to be honest, it was so different. I think that we can serve ourselves very well if we just allow the experience and try not to govern it too much. And that might sound very clever for somebody who's in a very, really deep sense of grief at the moment, but grief will do what it's going to do. Grief will express itself through you. And it's not an illness. It's not something really that needs to be fixed, particularly in the early stages anyway. And so in answer to your question, I think that I used things on a daily basis. Some things worked one day and they didn't work the next.
Right.
And it's really about staying in there and finding those tiny little things that will work. And sometimes it's about just allowing yourself to have a meltdown. Sometimes it's about, putting a pillow in the bed and holding it. Sometimes it's about going outside and expressing your sadness to the world. Sometimes it's just being quiet. It changes every single moment and every single day. And I think that's the most frightening thing for people. And a lot of people get in touch with me and they say, I haven't cried for 5 days. Is there something wrong?
Yeah.
Or I'm not able to stop crying. Is there something wrong? Or I'm having anger attacks. Is there something wrong? And, my overriding message is always, no, you're on track. You're absolutely on track. So whatever you are experiencing in the moment or in the day, it's okay. I always feel so much for people who have to go out to work, who can't hide their grief, who can't stay at home and need to go out and earn a living. And I always think that's a really complex area to manage, and it takes more energy than maybe just being allowed to move away and stay with your grief. And I worked out with people that maybe one way of doing this is actually to allow yourself periods where you're allowed to grieve. So you have sort of stages in the day where you're allowed to check in with your grief and also express it. Because one thing I do know is that if we express it, it doesn't build up into that awful meltdown that can happen. So maybe find times in the day where you privately check in with yourself and see how you're doing. And I always say, schedule in a time in the day, if you can, for your grief. And it sounds a bit strange, but your grief needs your attention. It is really the result of deep love. And grief is not something that we should try and medicate or hide or push away. And a lot of people try to push it away because it's so frightening and so overwhelming and so destabilizing. And from my experience as a therapist, it's, obviously not good to push anything away. And Maudsley said, what the body doesn't express in tears causes other organs to weep. And I think that's a really lovely quote for grief, really, because stemming our grief and trying really hard is using energy we don't have necessarily to cope with it. Whereas if you allow it to come through and allow it to have its place, it will, be at least less exhausting than pushing. And
I'm going to say is a lot of people may feel like it's too painful to go there. I'm just going to block this out and I'm going to keep going. But the thing there is it keeps accumulating, and the stress, and that it has to go somewhere.
It has to go somewhere.
And for those who find it too painful, whatever stage they're at, and it's just too much to go there, what advice would you have there? Maybe they're afraid that if they go there, it just won't stop and they'll break. How can one begin to gently go there?
Yeah, I think, grief is kind of wise, Sue. And, grief knows when to burst that bubble of emotion. Grief knows when you need to be numb. Grief pretty much knows everything. And so I always say to people, it's a kind of an organic experience. And, it is so deeply painful and so deeply overwhelming that almost to just stay with it and reassure yourself that you're on track, that you are okay, that you will be okay. And, just see what happens with it on a daily basis. There's nothing you need to do apart from self-care. And it's self-care, which is the biggest part of grieving, really. And it's about finding tiny, tiny ways to nurture yourself through this. And as I said earlier, what might work one day might not work the next. So it's about having almost a list of things, but you'll know intuitively what will work. And a lot of the time it is going to bed. And I'll share with you, after my husband died, I actually went to bed for 2 weeks. And I drank tea and ate jam sandwiches. I didn't do very little. I was pregnant, but all I needed to do was be in that space. I was so shocked and traumatized and numb. I had no way of being in touch with anything. And slowly but surely, the grief crept in, and I had periods where I did have my meltdowns and I did express it, and then I'd go through a period of being numb again. And that's what frightens people the most, is when they're not crying. They become very frightened that there's something wrong with their grief, that it's complicated. But I always liken the brain and the psyche to, in grief, a bit like ABS braking in a car. You know, when you press the brakes, it kind of goes da, 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 da. I always liken the experience of grief a little bit like that. We have a wisdom within us, and the reality is allowed in incrementally as we can manage it psychologically. So there's no need to force anything or try and, you know, screw it out of anything. It will sort of naturally go in its flow. It's about understanding that you're not doing it wrong. There is no right way to do grief. And one time I had two sisters independently contact me, interestingly, and they'd lost their mother. And they were looking for support in grief. And the two sisters were diametrically opposite, but they weren't getting on because one was numb and one was crying all the time.
Right. And
so when I was able to say, this sister is perfectly on track and the other sister is perfectly on track, they were able to get on again. But there can often be a lot of judgments that come through in loss as well. And
that's actually what was coming to my mind, is for those who are close to people who have lost someone, and for them, the bystander, if you like, or the observer, to be aware that there's no right and wrong way, that there's just that other person's way. And I often think with situations, and not just with this, the best thing that we can do is not try, you can't fix it, but just to be with that person. Often a person doesn't need your advice or you to try and fix them or make things better, but just to be with.
Absolutely.
And I guess to also respect how that other person wants to deal with it themselves. Because sometimes we try, I think, out of goodwill and compassion, we try to make things better.
And it's a brave friend. It's true, Sue, because it's a brave friend who can stand by and not try and fix, because it is difficult to not try and fix. But, you know, often people feel judged through their grieving process, because I think what happens is, you see, the person who's not grieving, their world is carrying on as normal. The merry-go-round is happening. But the person who's experiencing the grief, of course, their world has stopped.
Yes.
But time passes for the other person in the same linear sense. So after 6 weeks, of course, if you're not experiencing the grief to that degree, people are going, oh, well, it's in my past now. And of course, it's still very current in the person who's lost. So it's understanding that actually grief takes a long time, no matter what the type of grief. And, you know, in my research a couple of years ago, I was looking through the Victorians and their attitude to grief. Now, of course, we're not Victorians, but I really do like that year of mourning. I really do like it. And I do like that old habit or custom of wearing a black armband. So society then knows that you are in your grief and you're given a wide berth. It's like, you know, a woman who's pregnant. She's given her, you know, all the things that she needs to go through a pregnancy, to be able to stand up for her on the bus and so on. And I do think that society is failing us in that way. I think grief is something that's been pushed away, and this modern fast life doesn't allow the space for grief. And I would love it if we could do it like the Victorians. And this 1 year, in my theory about grief is that this 1 year from the time the person passes until the first anniversary, as we call it, it's a very, very, very important time. And it's a very, very important time insofar as this time next year, you won't be able to say this time last year. So it's about honoring that year in a way that works for you, in a way that you don't feel hurried, in a way that actually society acknowledges that you are in your grief and that you are going through this process. And I invite some of my clients to make it a ritual, to every little thing, to note it and recognize it. the first time you do something, it's painful, but also maybe just find something about that you just note. So you're making the ritual of it, even though society doesn't give us that year of mourning, that we can make it our year of mourning, you know, and not that mourning ends after the year, but it can be the most particularly awful time, and that whatever you can find in noting it and honoring it, and it's about honoring the person that's not there anymore. And the first times for everything is so tough, but it can also be an honoring.
Yeah, and giving yourself that permission.
Sure.
To have that space.
Yes.
And also, I think in a lot of cases, and as you said, we're all different, but there's no time frame on grief. And I think sometimes, as I said, we're all different, but it doesn't go away, but you learn to live with something. And I think that's also, for me, that's been important, in knowing that that's been my experience. And not, I think when we also try and resist anything, we increase the pain and the struggle when we try and stop something in general.
Well, it's so painful, I think, that of course it's a natural response to move away from it, and it's a very difficult thing to actually embrace it and stay with it. But I think embracing, if you can, and staying with it, uses less energy, uses less emotional energy, physical energy, as this is absolutely so painful, this is so catastrophic, I'm so overwhelmed.
Yes.
Yeah, but there are
that's what we actually do in self-compassion. We validate and we acknowledge that this is so difficult and painful for me. So we're validating our feelings and our emotions rather than trying to resist them. And like you said, when you do that, and not just with grief, you tend to bounce back quicker from adversity in general. When you give yourself, like you said, in self-care, what you need, what do I need right now?
Yeah, it is.
Through your experiences, is there any advice that you could give people based on your experience? I know this is very personal. So based on your experience, plus the people you have so wonderfully supported through this journey. I know we did mention earlier that for the first year, generally one doesn't avail of therapy or support in that way. Is that correct?
Well, of course, support is vital.
Support, yes.
Yes, it's really vital. But we wouldn't advocate that grief is considered an illness or, anything that's psychologically wrong. It's a natural process. So, of course, reach out and get lots and lots of support and talk to people who've had grief experiences. Surround yourself with people who can nurture you and nourish you in so many ways. But in terms of grief, grief doesn't really become complicated unless it doesn't start to change after about a year and a half. And if you're stuck at that point, then of course, do go and, engage a therapist or a coach or somebody you feel that you can work with to work through the deeper feelings and maybe figure out why it's becoming difficult for you to process. And often there's, people have underlying griefs before their grief, underlying difficulties that they didn't have time to resolve or never got to resolve. So it can be complicated, but I think that the reassurance is there that the first year is about just going through that experience of grief and trusting and knowing that you're okay, that you are going to be fine. But if you feel that you're not, of course, reach out and, get some help. But, it really does, it becomes such a personal journey. And I think the only thing that really stood out for me, Sue, was, am I doing this right? Is there something I'm not doing right? And particularly coming up to Christmas, I remember, thinking, how am I actually going to do this? How am I going to manage to navigate this? Because the pain was so intense that I almost felt that I would break open. And, people have children and, you know, responsibilities. So it's not something that we can completely forget about Christmas and not do it. It generally is something that we can continue. And some people might like to cancel it. But from my mind, I think that the way we can do Christmas when there's a loss is to try and just break the pattern a little bit and maybe just do Christmas a little bit differently. And it'll obviously be very painful, but they can be a way of honoring the person at Christmas and maybe have a candle lit permanently. Some people even like to set for absent friends at tables. Whatever it is that feels right works, you know, and it will change. But making new memories is painful. Making new memories at anniversaries and birthdays and Christmas, it's painful. So again, it's about caring as best you can for yourself through the experience of it, and just keep reminding yourself, I've never done this way before. I may have grieved in another way. I've never done it this way. There is no roadmap. Where, you know, there's books, but there's no roadmap for each of us, and each of us, our experiences is so individual. And I think that coming up to Christmas and all of this, managing your energy is vital. You know, managing what you can do or not is vital, and having that boundary for yourself, because people are going to want to help and people are going to want to bring you out, and if they're allowed with COVID, but it's about sort of settling in with yourself and saying, I can manage this much, or, you know, I can't manage that. And it's a time, if you can, for having good boundaries, or if you've got somebody who can be your advocate. I found that really helpful. I had a girlfriend who managed to be that interface between people, and I was able to say to her, you know, please, can you tell these people I love them and thank you, but I'm not able. And so it really is about putting those parameters in. And most people have to care for somebody towards Christmas. And if you've got children, of course, that is a very, very tender thing. You're dealing with your own grief. You're dealing with your children's grief. And it's about slowly winding your way, doing it a little bit differently. And of course, honoring people's feelings and being real. And I think being real is very difficult for a parent, for instance, with their children, because of course they want to protect them. But in a way, children are able to understand better if the parent leads them in grief. So there can be a time in the day on Christmas Day for the grief. There can be a time on Christmas Day for the grief. We have no rules, and there should be no rules for anyone going through Christmas in loss. And that's the one thing I would certainly say, is hold on tight to your boundaries and the way you feel is right for you. There are no obligations. And if there are obligations, get that friend, or if you're able yourself, put those boundaries in there. And I always think though, and if Christmas is completely unbearable, the thought of Christmas is completely unbearable, and it's okay for you and your circumstances allow, how about doing something like volunteering? How about doing something different, so that we do know through the neuroscience of it that giving back does help us. And there are people out there who may very well do better by going out and helping other people. And I think that's another thing to keep in mind, that's a possibility, that you can do it your way, and at the same time mind yourself.
There's no rules. And so many of us, so many people hinge so much on Christmas, and to challenge, I guess, that perception. Yes, I know it's very painful when somebody isn't there, but challenge the perception of how things should be. And you can change it. They're your rules. There are no rules. You can
Absolutely.
do it your way.
You can do it your way.
To feel okay about that, I guess. And also for this year, Rachel, in particular, when possibly loved ones have passed and they didn't have that same farewell, and maybe their support structure couldn't all be present, during and after. That adds to the pain and the sorrow.
And the guilt, Sue. You know, they can be guilt from that. And you're absolutely right. That is a very difficult circumstance. You know, somebody's died in hospital and you haven't been able to be present.
Yeah.
I think that comes back to honoring the person again that's lost, finding a ritualistic way of honoring that. And it
Yes.
may be for different people, different things, but that candle permanently lit.
Yes.
Maybe writing some letters, writing cards, expressing yourself through letters, poetry. And you know, song and music is another interesting way of bringing the deceased in an honorable way, and it can be very painful, but again it can remind the people of the times they shared with somebody. And I would say, you know, find ingenious ways that work and really feel right. And if it doesn't feel right tomorrow, then it's okay too. And stay in your pajamas, and you know, don't go outside the door if it doesn't feel right. You know, the one thing I do say I think is really important is, if you can, is to be very careful around alcohol and drug intake and that sort of thing, because of course that can make very complicated experiences when we are deeply upset. And I'll share with you, you know, I did use wine at a time when I was in deep, deep grief. And I have to say, it definitely complicated things. The only thing it did do was it made me just feel a little bit more relaxed and whatever. But looking back, I would say I wish I didn't. And I think staying away from alcohols and substances or anything will only help you, you know, in the time. And
so, yeah, that's it. So it's so easy to turn to a quick fix, a quick, like a temporary, but the long term, that's, we know that that's not the answer. So for people, I guess there, do you know, are there like, there must be even online support groups, or like we were speaking about, if there was like a grief counselor or a therapist, which as you say there is down the line, that people have like those more helpful coping strategies in place.
Yeah, and often, Sue, it's really about expressing ourselves.
Yeah.
You know, grief can be a very lonely experience. And often I find there's a lot of shame and guilt around grief. And sometimes the relationship with the deceased hasn't been good, or maybe there's been a row or something like that. And it's about navigating your way through that. And so absolutely reach out for support in that way. When I said, you know, about therapy, it's more about, we don't need to pathologize grief. It's not an illness. Excuse me, but we definitely benefit from having that support. And sometimes it's somebody you don't know. Sometimes it's a professional or a support group. There are forums online. There are people who coach in grief. I do. There are people who, even the Samaritans, you know, people like that, they're all there for you if it becomes overwhelming. But I do think that 1 hour every week that you can give to your expression for your grief with another adult person who's, again, not trying to fix your grief, but just to witness and honor your experience. I think that's probably one of the most important things, is you have an outlet, particularly if you've got to look after people in your loss, and that you have the support mechanisms in place for you. And it's not always easy to do so, but sometimes friends can be helpful, but sometimes they can also go into that compassion fatigue when our grieving does go on for a long time. So that's how a professional can be really, really helpful, that ear. And also to say, you're on track, you know? And, you know, so you and I both work in a sort of a similar area in terms of mindfulness. And I think that breath and stretching are really, really, really important in helping the body and the mind to express. I did work with a lady in the summer who was experiencing terribly deep grief. And while I was working with her, I actually had her go down onto the ground and just lay there and have her listen to what I was saying while she was laying there, so that she felt held, because we were on Zoom, we weren't able to meet in person, and that, so she felt held. And the one thing that when people are in grief and when they're traumatized, they don't breathe. And we've spoken about this before. The breath is so important, to come home to our breath. And that means to breathe fully and consciously. We tend to breathe very shallow, and we suck our breath in. And actually just learning to breathe in and breathe out in the most challenging times can be actually very restorative and supportive if you don't have other support. And I think you probably agree with me, Sue, that breath is life-giving and life-affirming in your worst moments, in your deepest challenging moments. Just that breath can bring you back to a moment where you just cope for a little bit longer.
Yeah, I find, yeah, exactly. I find it's very healing. It's very comforting. It also, as you said, that deep, slow breathing calms your whole nervous system. It's always there for you. And also, what was I going to say there? The breath, it's always there. Although something else now, it's gone out of my mind. Also, it brings you back into the present moment. So, and I also think if you're challenged with anything, taking one moment at a time, rather than projecting into the future.
Absolutely right.
Spending too much time in the past, staying just fully in the present moment, because that's all you've got, and that's all, and you're given what you need to deal with in that moment. And the breath is a great anchor for bringing you back to that space.
Absolutely. And sometimes it's all you've got, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So again, it's these simple things that can make a huge
Absolutely
difference.
And I like what you just said there as well, Sue, and I was going to come to that later, is looking at the bigger picture. And that's what we tend to do when we're challenged, when we're in grief, when we're in catastrophic circumstances. And again, bringing your mind back to the moment, and it is literally moment to moment to moment to moment, and that's okay. That is making progress. You know, you don't need to accomplish anything very much, and your body and your mind will generally do it for you. Your body and your mind are your wisdom in these circumstances, and if you just allow the body and the mind to do what they do, and of course you have to patch yourself up to go out to the shops and all of those sort of things, but actually grief expressed will allow you to do that. You know, grief expressed will give you that space and freedom. It's when you push it back, that's when it erupts in times when you really would rather it didn't, you know.
Yeah, but actually what just came to me right there is I can also visualize a lot of people could be avoidant of going out and circumstances and events because they're so afraid that their emotions will show and that they will, you know, break down or cry. What I would say is, and you could, it's just again my opinion, is because I know what avoidance is like, and it can be a detrimental cycle. So my thoughts there would be, go to where you feel safe and where you feel supported in those whatever length of time it is. And it's okay to show your emotions, and it's okay to cry. So that's what I would say there is, it would be, you don't want to see people becoming avoidant and isolating themselves when yes, there is a time for that, but you also don't want them to fall into that trap.
Absolutely, Sue, I totally agree with you. And I think that is a difficult one, because a lot of people are you know, quite uncomfortable when people express their emotions in public. But, you know, I think that people who are grieving get good at doing that in a way, you know, and I think that if you can at least be comfortable expressing your emotions in private, that's a good start. Okay. You know, if you're not able to do that in private, then of course it's going to be super difficult. And it goes back to that, what works for you, allow it. There is no right and there is no wrong. And there's another school of thought, Sue, that you know, actually continuing your gratitude list in grief is a wonderful way of navigating grief again, because often it's, as you said earlier, you know, it's just about, sometimes we've only got our breath left. And so it's finding those minute little things, and having gratitude for them makes the grief process a deeper experience. And it somehow softens that belief that there is still some life there, and that there is something else for me. It may not feel real or big at the moment, but there is just something small there in the background waiting for me. But when we're in grief, we are on a ship bound for a shore we don't know the destination of. And that is, you know, how I think is the most important thing to say, that, you know, you will come through this, you will be different, you will not be the same, and but you will be wiser, you will be more formed, you will have more experience. And those tears are an expression of deep love. That is, you know, the absolute expression of it. It is deep love.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Rachel. I think there's been, I'll just say, I don't think anybody has any questions, but it's been a beautiful time to chat. And if anybody on the playback, on the replay has questions, please do reach out. Rachel does, you do talks and you do coaching or therapy for those experiencing grief. And you will find Rachel's details online. Rachel Gotto. Remind me again, is it .com or?
.com. Yeah, thank you, Sue.
Nice and easily.
And easy.
Nice and easy. And Rachel is there, and she knows, she understands, plus she has the professional experience to support you. And on that note, I just wish, Rachel, everybody well for the month ahead. And we acknowledge and appreciate that it can be so difficult for so many people. And just don't put pressure on yourself. And I love everything Rachel said. And thank you, Rachel. Thank you for that.
You're welcome. And it's a lovely chat. And I just want to say to everybody that you will be okay. You will make it through. It will be difficult, but you will make it through moment by moment, and make new memories, do it slightly differently, and do it your way.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Rachel. And thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you, Sue. It's lovely to talk to you again.